Gareth sat on the ground, his legs folded beneath him, feeling the cool metal of the ship's floor through his uniform. The dim light overhead flickered slightly, casting long shadows that danced across the walls of the room. In his lap lay a sketch pad, its pages thick and worn from use. His fingers hesitated before turning the first page, as if he was almost afraid to disturb the art within. But curiosity got the better of him. As he flipped through the pages, his breath caught. The drawings were nothing short of incredible. Each line, each shade of graphite brought the images to life in a way that felt almost too real, as if the people and scenes on the paper might step off the page at any moment. The most recent drawing he came across was one of Deeg, their boisterous captain. Though only half finished, it already captured his personality perfectly. Deeg's grin, as wide and infectious as ever, stretched from ear to ear. The captain was depicted lounging in his usual spot, seated comfortably in his command chair, his posture relaxed yet authoritative. Even in this incomplete state, Gareth could almost hear Deeg's voice echoing in his mind, cracking some joke that had the whole crew laughing. Carefully, Gareth flipped back a page, revealing another stunning portrait, this one of Tunny T. The level of detail was astounding. The drawing was a hyper-realistic, two-dimensional rendering that captured every minute feature of Tunny T's intricate appearance. The white and gray scales covering Tunny T's skin were painstakingly depicted, each one shining faintly in the dim light of the laboratory they were working in. Even the fine cracks along their beak were drawn with precision. Tunny T wasn't looking at the viewer. Instead, they were deeply engrossed in their work, their attention focused on a laboratory table littered with detailed tools and equipment. Gareth marveled at how Penelope had captured not just their physical appearance, but also their intense concentration. "Wow," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the stillness of the room. He caught himself, suddenly aware of the sleeping figure nearby. His head snapped up to check if she had stirred. Penelope was still asleep, lying sprawled out on the bed in the corner, her soft snores breaking the silence. Her breath rose and fell rhythmically, completely undisturbed. Gareth let out a small sigh of relief. He continued flipping through the pages, each drawing more incredible than the last. His fingers stopped on a portrait of Thwill, one of their more elusive crewmates. Thwill's sketch was almost life-sized. The gray fur covering his form was captured with surprising accuracy, each strand visible in the sketch. His expression, however, was what intrigued Gareth the most. Thwill looked furtive, his eyes darting toward the ship's engines, as if he was trying to solve some mechanical problem in his mind. The simplicity of the medium, just graphite on paper, stood in stark contrast to the complexity of the artwork itself. Gareth hadn't seen non-digital art in a long time, and the level of skill it required struck him deeply. The texture of the graphite made Thwill's fur almost seem touchable, and it evoked a nostalgic feeling in Gareth, a reminder of how things used to be before everything became screens and holograms. As Gareth turned another page, he froze. His own face stared back at him from the page. The likeness was uncanny. He blinked, not entirely sure how to process seeing himself like this. What struck him most was the expression Penelope had chosen to capture. It wasn't stern or judgmental, as he might have expected. Instead, his face was soft, almost kind, with a gentle smile playing on his lips. His eyes, which he often thought seemed too tired in the mirror, looked calm and at peace in the drawing. He was seated in a field of tall, swaying grasses, a golden sunset casting a warm glow behind him. It took him a moment to realize where the scene came from. This was a memory, a real moment. The small hill on the outskirts of the Raxian colony where he and Penn had shared a quiet evening together, just the two of them, as the sun dipped below the horizon. He hadn't thought much of that moment at the time, but now, seeing it through her eyes, it felt significant. He ran his fingers lightly over the drawing, marveling at the care and attention Penelope had poured into it. Every portrait he'd seen so far wasn't just a random depiction, it was a memory, a snapshot of a real moment that meant something to her. It was as if Penn had plucked these scenes straight from her mind and translated them onto the page with stunning accuracy. The next page, however, sent a chill down his spine. Gareth found himself staring at a drawing of Penelope's helmet. He recognized it immediately, the visored, full-cover helmet from the set they'd returned to the humans. But this drawing was unsettling. The perspective was odd. It was drawn from the point of view of someone holding the helmet in their hands, though the hands depicted were human. He assumed they were Penelope's own. But what truly disturbed him was the reflection in the visor. The background was normal enough, just the ceiling of the nebulous cargo hold, complete with part of the crane arm attached overhead. But reflected in the visor was a figure that Gareth knew instantly was meant to be Penelope. The figure had her hair, though it was drawn slightly shorter than it was now, and the outline of her head and shoulders were unmistakable. But her face was missing. Not incomplete, not left blank as if the drawing was unfinished, but shaded and contoured as if a face should be there, yet devoid of any features. There were no eyes, no nose, no mouth. The more Gareth stared at it, the more unsettled he became. The human form was still foreign to him in many ways, but he had grown to understand how much humans communicated through their facial expressions. Penelope, especially, conveyed so much with just a look. But here, in this drawing, the absence of that face, the absence of everything he had learned to read in her, made him deeply uncomfortable. Almost on reflex, he flipped the page, shaking off the eerie feeling. His heart was still pounding in his chest when he looked down at the next drawing. This one was different. It was larger, taking up both the current page and spilling onto the back of the previous one. It depicted a group of people, humans, gathered in what looked like a hangar. Some were sitting on crates, others standing, but all were smiling and laughing, as if they had just shared a private joke. In the middle of the scene, someone was passing around a bottle that Gareth recognized immediately. It was the same type of bottle that Penn had taken a sip from earlier, Ricilla, if he remembered correctly. Before he examined this drawing in detail, Gareth flipped through the next few pages and realized that each member of this group had a corresponding portrait. They were all connected, and as he looked at each portrait, he could feel the care Penelope had taken in crafting these images. These were her old crew members, the people she had fought alongside Fire Team Cerberus. Flipping back and forth between the group portrait and the individual ones, Gareth slowly began to put faces to names. These weren't just vague, armored figures from a recording anymore. These were people. He studied the man standing to the far left, who held the bottle of Ricilla in one hand and a glass in the other. This had to be Captain Alvarez. In the group drawing, he was mid-shrug, as if he had just made a joke, his face relaxed and grinning. Gareth had imagined Alvarez to look very different, older, perhaps more grizzled, but in his portrait, the man was youthful, almost boyish. His dark hair was short, even shorter than Penelope's, and he had a neat bit of facial hair around his mouth, a stark contrast to the clean-shaven faces of the others. Despite his young appearance, his grin was wide and confident, radiating the kind of ease that only came from years of command. Next to Alvarez stood a woman, much shorter than Penelope, yet she carried herself with undeniable authority. This was Jane Ashera. In the group drawing, she was caught mid-laugh, but her individual portrait told a different story. Her face was lined with stress, her features drawn and tired. A scar ran up the side of her neck, across one ear, hinting at battles fought and survived. Despite the weariness in her face, her eyes held a warmth that Gareth found almost maternal. She had the look of someone who had seen much and yet still carried a quiet strength. Moving further across the group, Gareth's eyes landed on a stout, well-built young man. This had to be Mac. Penelope had described him with a term Gareth hadn't fully understood at the time, a shit-eating grin. But now, seeing his portrait, the description made perfect sense. Mac's face was lit up with a mischievous smile, his eyes sparkling with the kind of playful energy that could only come from someone who was always up to no good. His hair was cut short, like his captain's, and his youthful, almost boyish features made him seem much younger than the rest of the crew. Despite his size, there was something lighthearted about him, like he was always ready to crack a joke or pull a prank. Next to Mac stood a smaller woman, her frame slight but clearly athletic. This was Leia Nakari, the smallest member of the group, but no less formidable. In the group drawing, she and Mac were exchanging grins, as if they were plotting something together. Her face was sharp and angular, with a sly grin that suggested she was always one step ahead of everyone else. Gareth could tell that Leia was the type to move quietly, to slip in and out of situations without being noticed, yet her confidence was unmistakable. And then there was Joshua Wally, the tallest of the group, standing at the back with a bottle of water in his hand. Unlike the others, his smile was more subdued, his eyes darker, more serious. In his portrait, the lines around his eyes were deeper, his expression weighed down by something heavy. There was a quiet sadness in his gaze, a mourning that Gareth didn't fully understand, but it was there, unmistakable. Yet, even in his seriousness, there was something comforting about him, a steady presence that grounded the group. Finally, there was Penelope. She hadn't drawn her own portrait separately, but she was there, in the group, leaning casually against a crate with a drink in her hand. Her smile was wide, her laughter practically jumping off the page. Gareth couldn't help but feel a pang of something, nostalgia, perhaps, or maybe a quiet longing. This version of Penelope, the one in the drawing, looked so different from the Penelope he knew now. In the picture, she was carefree, her guard down, laughing without a care in the world. The weight of everything she'd been through, all the loss and pain, seemed to have evaporated in that moment. She looked happy. Happier than Gareth had ever seen her. As he studied her in the drawing, he couldn't help but wonder if this was the real Penelope. The one who existed before everything fell apart. The one who had been part of something, a family, a crew. A version of her that he would never fully know. Gareth's fingers brushed the edges of the drawing before he noticed something slip out from between the pages. He reached down to pick it up and found a small photograph. It was a printed image, old and slightly worn, and as he looked at it, he realized that it was a photograph of the group drawing Penelope had made. This must have been the original, the real memory that Penelope had sketched from. He was so engrossed in the discovery that he didn't notice the shift in the room. The subtle change in breathing. The absence of the soft snores. Done snooping? Penelope's voice cut through the silence like a blade. Gareth jumped, startled, the sketch pad nearly slipping from his hands. The photograph fluttered to the ground, and he scrambled to pick it up, his heart racing. Penelope slid off the bed, moving with the lazy grace of someone who had just woken up. She stretched her arms above her head before bending down to retrieve the fallen items. She picked up the photograph first, holding it between her fingers before glancing over at Gareth, her expression unreadable. Hey, she teased, her voice soft but carrying that familiar edge of sarcasm. Don't damage my stuff. Gareth blinked, still too stunned to form a coherent response. He watched her as she casually picked up the sketch pad and closed it, giving him a small, teasing grin. Her tone was light, but there was something behind her eyes, something darker, just beneath the surface. I'm just messing with you, she continued, laughing softly as she set the pad aside on the small table beside her bed. It's fine. I mean, I know you're curious. Gareth's throat was dry. He had to say something. Now was the moment. He had been holding onto this secret for too long, and it was time to come clean. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a brief second, he considered not telling her. But he knew he couldn't keep it to himself any longer. I wasn't trying to snoop, Gareth began, his voice shaky. He swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. It's just these drawings. They're amazing. Penelope gave him a soft smile, her features softening slightly. I can tell you who's who if you want, she offered. I mean, I know I've mentioned them before, but the names probably don't mean much without the faces, right? Gareth nodded, but his mind was racing. This was it. He had to tell her. He paused, taking a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the photograph. "I actually already know who they are." Penelope's brow furrowed in confusion, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. "What do you mean?" Gareth's heart was beating so fast he thought it might burst out of his chest. His mouth felt dry, and the words seemed to catch in his throat. But he forced himself to continue. When we were with Samir, during the dinner, when I left to go to the bathroom, he showed me the restricted footage." He could see the change in Penelope's expression, but he pressed on. "The footage of what happened to you all in the city. In that building." The shift in Penelope was immediate. The playful grin, the lightness in her demeanor, vanished in an instant. Her eyes hardened, and her face grew cold, her posture tense as she stared at him, her jaw tightening. The temperature in the room seemed to drop, and the air became thick with the weight of what Gareth had just confessed.